Who are you going to believe when it comes to the military situation in Ukraine? I suggest that you look into the situation yourself and you decide for yourself. Most Western news media are pumping out a narrative that Ukraine is holding on, it's doing well, and we have other media sources, but some of them are hard to find, others are in foreign languages, so you have to dig a little bit and you have to search. Also, you need to follow along what's going on the front lines and what's going on as far as the military equipment, as far as the the progress of the military strategy. So we see that Ukraine, before the special military operation, had roughly 1 million soldiers. They were being trained for many years by NATO, being sent to the United States, to Scotland, to many countries to be trained. They were given the best equipment and they were given satellite feeds and everything. And when the special military operation started, and the Russians sent in basically about 80 to 100,000 that were completely, a 10-to-1 ratio, Ukrainian soldier versus Russian soldier. So this wasn't in any way a full scale invasion. The Ukrainians, instead of going to dialogue, attacked. Well, first they asked the Russian forces to move to the outside of Kiev, and then they attacked them, and so basically, the Russians realized that this situation wouldn't be solved in negotiation table, or in a through dialogue. This would only be solved on the battlefield. So over time, Russia had to move its forces closer to the Donbas because they were completely overwhelmed. Remember, they came in with 80 to 100,000. Ukraine had roughly 1 million, and they were trained. They were armed to the teeth. The Western countries gave them everything, gave them the best equipment, the best training. So it should have looked like a cakewalk for the Ukrainians, but the Russians hung in there and then slowly started their military strategies. They started to adapt. In the beginning, there was parity on a lot of levels, on the drones, on the tanks, on the soldiers, on the artillery. And when we get to the artillery, this is extremely important. It's not talked about in the media. They'll talk about renovating the strategy. They talk about, getting drones and long range missiles. But 80% of the casualties in the battlefield are from artillery, and Russia now has a 6 to 10 to 1 advantage over Ukraine. And so Ukraine has fallen far behind. Russia has specifically targeted their artillery. They look for it, and then they look for the Patriot systems wherever they're at. And Ukraine invariably sent their Patriot systems too close to the front and were easy to be detected. And so instead of hunkering down in a well protected, well fortified area, they kept on moving them around. And Russia has drones in the air just about everywhere, checking out what's going on, what's coming here, what's going there. And so they picked out all those Patriot missile air defense batteries and knocked them out one by one until the conflict in the Middle East began. And then Russia came and said, oh, by the way, I need a few of these, and took a whole bunch to Israel. And Ukraine was left with a deficit as far as air defense. So ever since then, they've been pleading, we need air defense, we need air defense. But air defense isn't going to slow down the Russian soldiers or their advance. Also on the front line, there is if you go to deep state map.live, which is a Ukrainian resource. They used to be a couple days behind on updating their maps. Now they seem like they're a week or two behind. They just don't want to accept the reality on the front lines and what's going on. So this is really bad for Ukraine. What's happening? The whole front line is collapsing. Um, the Ukrainians were trying to cut off a salient north of Pokrovsk, where the Russians had advanced, kind of in a peninsula, and so the Ukrainians were attacking that formation, and they sent their best soldiers in, the Azov battalion, which, by the way, participated also in the Maidan revolution, and they're the elite soldiers. They're also, um, in many ways, linked to Nazi symbols and Nazi insignias and Nazi salutes. So these are these people hate the Russians more than anyone else. And so the Russians also hunt them out because they apparently committed war crimes around Mariupol and other parts of the Donbas. So there's not, you know, there is not a good feeling of the Russians towards the Azov, and not a good feeling of the Azov towards the Russians. So anyway, but we see that the Ukrainians sent the Azov in from the north, where they were holding back the Russian advance, um, and they sent them into the Pokrovsk area to try to cut out that kind of peninsula advance of the Russians. And they found immediate success in the beginning, but over time the Russians sent in reinforcements and have slowed down the Ukrainian counterattack. So now they sent all these forces to the Pokrovsk area, and the other areas of Ukraine are now extremely short of manpower. And so the Russians are advancing across the whole front line, and the Russians are advancing to the west of Pokrovsk. They're advancing towards Siversk, um, and in the Lyman area. They're advancing in the Kupiansk area. They're a little bit more, and they will create a cauldron in the Kupiansk area. But also, they have been sending reinforcements into Kupiansk, but it doesn't seem to be slowing the Russians down. So, if you listen to the Western media, it sounds like, they talk about the Russians advancing inches. Um, but take a look at the map and realize that Ukraine is a big country, a big country, okay? So it may not look like much on the map, but the Russians are advancing. And also, the other thing you need to keep in mind, that the Russians aren't fighting for territory. They're fighting to exhaust the Ukrainian military. So they're exhausting them in their equipment, in their manpower, in their drone operators, in their support, in the industry that's creating the drones. And they wiped out the Sapsan, which was the Ukrainian version of the German Taurus missile. They took out one factory after another that was producing uh, equipment, or anything related to their drones or their robots. So anyway, before you listen to Sky News or BBC and you hear about how well the Ukrainians are doing and how they're holding out, just think of a couple of things. They're now recruiting people over 60 years old because they don't have any other age group to recruit from. And basically, they were going to start recruiting from the 18 to 23-year-old range, but they figured that there would be a revolt, and it wouldn't be the Russians that would throw them out, the Ukrainian government out of power. It would be their own people. So that would be a much worse humiliation than if the Russians defeated them. So the last thing they want to do is the people to revolt and hang them on a tree like Mussolini. And so they decided, hey, those people want to leave the country, you get out of here. So they opened the borders and said, woof, time to go. But and then a whole bunch of other people said, hey, we're gonna come with you. And they caught some guy who was a uh, he was the keeper for one of their professional soccer teams at, you know, some years ago. So anyway, they caught a whole bunch of people in their network, and now I guess they're going to the front line. But you know, people who are over 60 years old, I'm not going to exaggerate. You're just not really the military age anymore, and um, it doesn't matter the money. It doesn't matter nothing can turn back the clock when you're over 60, because when you're in the military, you have to run, you have to lift heavy things, you have to avoid uh, you know being falling into the snare of the other of the combatants on the other side. So you have to think quick. You have to learn a lot of complicated. It's not just grabbing a gun and shooting it. There's all kinds of military equipment that have to be used, and so you get a little older, you get a little slower. Not only physically but also mentally. So if this is what Ukraine's putting on the front line, then they're in a really, really bad situation. So when you hear that they're recruiting people over 60, you say, "Wow, they opened up opportunities to all the elderly." But and somebody did comment. I don't remember the name of the person, but they said, "Hey, they're going to reduce their pension payments." So, but I'm looking at the casualty counts coming in from the Ukrainian army. The Department of Defense for Russia puts out the numbers. I mean, the numbers are just off the charts, and it seems like it's increasing. So, as we get close to the end of a conflict, the the casualty count goes up, because the initial soldiers who were there were professional soldiers. They had received long training. Um, they knew how to manage stress. They knew how to. They knew about strategy. They had various levels of preparation, and then you get to people who maybe have a 6 months of preparation. Well, they have a little bit of preparation, but not somebody who's been in there, 5, 6, 10 years, who studied strategy, who studied, you know, um, uh, how to win a war, so to speak. And then you start getting people that you're picking up on the street one day, and the next day they're on the front line. Well, you know what? They're going to be confused. They may not even know where north is. So, they may be given a compass, some device, and then they get separated from their troops, or they get put in a foxhole, and now they don't know what to do. They don't know if they should stay or go. They don't know that they're not able to adapt, and they get into this panic, and now they're easy prey for the drones that locate them in all these little caves and foxholes, and all these hiding places. So you know Ukraine, if they really cared about their people, they would go to the negotiating table and say, "Look, you can have 8 oblasts and Crimea. We just want to keep our country and keep our people safe." And I think Russia would say, "Okay, that's it. You can, as long as you're neutral and you demilitarize and denazify, and you don't join EU, you don't join NATO, then you're we can end this conflict today." But no, the people in Kiev, they got the billions coming in. Come on, come on, come on. And they're looking at the money, and they're looking at their bank account. Ukraine is one of the most corrupt countries in Europe. So we know that the billions that are being sent to Ukraine, a lot of it is going bye bye. You remember when the Soviet Union fell and Boris Yeltsin came in, and I was hearing about transfers being made to the west into Moscow, and like the same day it went from Moscow to Switzerland and some bank account, and there was a lot of corruption in the Boris Yeltsin government, and so, but we're looking at something very similar. And we also know that in Ukraine, people could be exempted from military service. They could just get this little white slip of paper that gave them the permission not to be mobilized or pulled into military service. And so they could pay $4,000 or $8,000 or $10,000, and they could get out of military service. And then if they wanted to get out of Ukraine, they'd have to pay a little more to cross the border. So, all these things, all these little, things were corruption. Well, corruption works in the sense of that the person who gets the money has to share with his boss, and his boss has to share with his boss, and all the way up. So the corruption in Ukraine is spread out from the very bottom to the very top. So we know that the money is just disappearing, doing a disappearing trick, and so it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. They could get the 300 billion that are in the frozen Russian assets, and they would be harping for more money in a couple of months. It would just disappear. It would go into some black hole. They would say, "Well, I contracted with so and so." With some American company or even European country, and then that country gives kickbacks, and so they will never see any equipment, but they made all these payments and everyone got paid off and everything. So um, people in the West also need to wake up. I mean, it's over. There's, it's just a horror movie in slow motion. The front line is collapsing. The Ukrainians don't have any more soldiers. They don't have the artillery, and now they're behind on the drones. And now they're trying to use these wonder weapons. And this was kind of Hitler's strategy at the end of World War II. He had the V2, which was incredibly advanced, a great technological uh, advancement from the Nazi scientists, but that was never going to change the the course of the conflict. And so it was all, everything came down to on the Eastern Front, the Soviets were advancing based on, they had more tanks, they had more uh, guns, and they had, and they, and then finally they got advantage on soldiers, and then they call it the Soviet steamroller, and that was moving its way to Berlin. And when uh, when the UK and US and French soldiers sitting on in England in their safe hideouts saw that the Soviet steamroller was starting to move its way through towards Berlin, and had uh, severely hampered the Nazis' um, military ranks. Then they decided, oh, now it's time to do Normandy. So they came in at basically when it was very close to. I mean, the Soviets could have finished off the Nazis alone, and the U.S. And and England soldiers and French soldiers just could have stayed in England. But they wanted to get a piece of the action, and they wanted to split up. Have a say at the table to split up Europe, even though it was really kind of unfair because the Soviets did about 80% of the work and the U.S. did about 20, U.S. and U.K. So anyway, um, and in the schools we're taught that the U.S. won the war. So anyway, there you go. Propaganda even in the schools. So don't believe the propaganda. Don't believe the stories. Just go to the facts. The facts are that Russia has advantage in artillery. They have an advantage in soldiers. They have better strategy. They're advancing, and the Ukraine is going to collapse. And so when it does, there's going to be a lot of unhappy people in NATO, in Washington, in in Canada, and all those who said that they sent billions to Ukraine and said, oh, here's and Ukraine gave them a IOU, and they're never going to get paid back. So anyway, I just encourage you to keep an open mind, look at all the sources, don't believe the narrative. The evil Russians are attacking the innocent Ukrainians. Well, there was a civil war started in 2014, and Russians stepped in 2022 to protect the ethnic Russians. And of course, there's a narrative for that, and they'll say there really weren't any ethnic Russians. They were all Ukrainians, and Russia just used that as an excuse to step in. So, anyway, you can believe what you like, but if you cut through all the propaganda, you'll get to the truth, I'm sure. And so I want to thank you for joining me today, and I wish everyone well. Hope you have a great day. If you like this video, hit the like button. If you would like to see more of these videos, subscribe. That supports independent journalism, and I look forward to seeing you in another video. Take care.